Imagine living in a city more crowded than Manhattan, but 2,000 years ago without traffic lights. Welcome to ancient Rome, the original urban jungle. At its peak, ancient Rome crammed over 1 million people into an area smaller than modern San Francisco. People lived stacked on top of each other in buildings that could collapse at any moment. The streets smelled like a mix of fresh bread, animal dung, and regret, and yet, somehow, the whole thing actually worked. But how? Where did people live? How did they get food? And most importantly, where did all that poop go? Let me tell you, you are not gonna like the answer. Well, it all came down to planning. Have you ever played SimCity and thought, I got this, before immediately bankrupting your virtual town? Well, the Romans didn't have that luxury. They had to get it right the first time. Romans didn't just throw their cities together like a last-minute group project. They had a system. Every city followed the same blueprint that included 2 massive roads cutting through the middle, dividing everything into neat, walkable blocks. First one was the Cardo Maximus that ran north to south, and the second one was the Decumanus Maximus that ran east to west. Collectively, it formed a layout so efficient that modern city planners still copy it today. And at the center of it all was the Forum, which was basically the Roman version of a town square if your local town square also featured political debates, public trials, street performers, and the occasional public execution for entertainment. It was the place to buy fresh produce, hear the latest gossip, or watch 2 senators argue over who had the better toga. But don't be fooled by the clean layout. Just because the streets were planned didn't mean they were pleasant. Rome had no traffic lights, no pedestrian walkways, and absolutely no rules against dumping your chamber pot out the window, meaning a casual stroll could quickly turn into a game of dodge the airborne disaster. And speaking of airborne disasters, let's talk about where all these Romans actually lived, because trust me, their housing situation made modern rent prices look like a minor inconvenience. The vast majority of Romans weren't lounging in marble villas with heated floors and private gardens. No, they were stuffed into insulae, which is the Roman version of budget high-rise apartments, except with more rats and significantly fewer safety regulations. These buildings were thrown together fast and stacked up to 5 stories high, then extended even higher when landlords decided structural integrity was more of a suggestion than a requirement. And the higher you lived, the worse your life got. The ground floors had actual walls and semi-decent insulation, so they were expensive. The upper floors were where you lived if your landlord actively wanted you to die. No running water, no heating, no bathrooms, and no way out if the place caught fire, which it frequently did. Fires were such a regular occurrence that if you were lucky, your building just collapsed instead. Then there was the noise. Thin walls meant zero privacy, so you got to enjoy your neighbors' conversations, arguments, and questionable life choices whether you wanted to or not. Some even complained about how trying to sleep in an insula was impossible because of the sounds of drunken brawls, street performers, and the neighbor's kid practicing the flute like a dying animal. So yeah, think of it as Airbnb, but with more screaming and definitely no refunds. Meanwhile, the rich were living in a completely different world. If you had money in Rome, you weren't sharing paper-thin walls with 6 strangers and a family of pigeons. You were relaxing in a domus, a spacious single-family home with courtyards, fountains, and actual private bathrooms, which in Rome was the equivalent of having a home theater and an infinity pool. And if the city got too loud for their delicate ears, no problem. They just retreated to their countryside villas where they could lounge around, hunt, and pretend the city's housing crisis wasn't their problem. For the poorest Romans, though, even the insulae were out of reach. If you couldn't afford rent, or just preferred to wake up without your building collapsing around you, your best option was the streets, public buildings, or temple steps. Some people slept in abandoned shops, others curled up near bathhouse furnaces for warmth, and some just gave up on sleep altogether and became professional drunks instead. Rome had a massive homeless population, but there was no social safety net. If you were down on your luck, you either found a way to hustle or you just didn't make it. And with all these people packed into a city that barely had a working sanitation system, you can probably guess that hygiene was not Rome's strong suit. But somehow, the city still managed to keep millions of people from literally drowning in filth. And the secret to that was aqueducts. If Rome had one major flex, it was water supply. This city wasn't just surviving, it was thriving on an insanely advanced aqueduct system that delivered more water per person than modern-day New York in 1998. Let that sink in. Ancient Rome, with no electricity, no pumps, no modern tools, figured out a way to funnel fresh water into the city so efficiently that it outperformed some modern water infrastructures. These 11 major aqueducts stretched for miles, using nothing but gravity to transport water from distant springs straight into Rome. They didn't just supply drinking water, they fed public fountains, bathhouses, gardens, and even the homes of the elite. Because, of course, if you were rich in Rome, you weren't fetching water from a dirty public fountain like some commoner. You had fresh aqueduct water piped straight into your villa. For everyone else, public fountains were the main water source. Romans lined up daily to fill jugs, wash up, or just splash some water on their faces and call it good. And if you really wanted to clean yourself up, there was one place every Roman knew to visit, which was the bathhouse. Now, Roman bathhouses weren't just glorified showers. These places were social hubs where you could bathe, gossip, make business deals, and probably judge each other's questionable hygiene. The bathhouses had everything: hot pools, cold pools, steam rooms, and sometimes even gyms. If you skipped bath day too often, people noticed, and in Rome, your reputation was everything. But water wasn't the only thing that needed moving through the city. Rome had a serious waste problem, and while they had some solutions, let's just say you would not want to take a deep breath walking through the streets. It was the kind of smell like accidentally walking into a Walmart bathroom at 2 a.m. Rome actually had a sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained wastewater out of the city and into the Tiber River. Sounds impressive, right? Yeah, except most homes weren't actually connected to it. So if you lived in an insula, your bathroom situation was just whatever bucket you had lying around. And what did you do when that bucket got full? You had two options. Number one, take it to a public latrine and enjoy the medieval group bathroom experience. Number two, throw it out the window and pray to Jupiter that it didn't land on someone important, because if it did, congrats, you just started a street brawl. This is why pedestrians carried leather hoods or wooden boards to shield themselves from falling surprises. Walking through Rome was a full-body experience, and not in a good way. Public latrines were technically a better option, but they came with their own nightmares. These weren't private stalls, they were long benches with holes where you and your fellow Romans could bond over synchronized bowel movements. No dividers, no privacy, and the same communal sponge on a stick for wiping. One sponge for an entire public restroom. If that doesn't make you appreciate toilet paper, nothing will. The streets were disgustingly filthy, but rain helped wash away most of the mess. Well, yeah, most of it. The Tiber River, on the other hand, became the ultimate trash can. Anything and everything got dumped in there. Sewage, garbage, dead animals, you name it. So if you were thirsty and didn't have access to a clean fountain, you really had to decide how badly you wanted that sip. The water had the same nutritional value as a gas station hot dog that had been sitting under the heat lamp since last week. For a city bursting at the seams with people, Rome somehow didn't collapse under the weight of its own filth. But now that we know how they got their water and what they did with it afterward, how did they manage to feed 1 million people every single day? Because keeping that many stomachs full, that was a logistical nightmare of its own. If you think meal prepping is a hassle, try feeding an entire city of over 1 million people without refrigerators, supermarkets, or drive-thrus. Somehow, ancient Rome kept its citizens mostly fed, and they did it through a mix of imports, government handouts, and some truly questionable farming techniques. But let's just say, if you weren't a fan of bread, tough luck, because your options were basically bread or slightly older bread. Rome didn't rely on local farms to feed its people, it relied on an entire empire. The city was basically a freeloading roommate that expected Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily to supply it with an endless stream of food. These regions were the empire's breadbasket, shipping out millions of tons of grain every year to keep Rome's citizens, and its many, many stray dogs, from rioting in the streets. And what was on the Roman menu? Meet the Mediterranean triad made out of grain, wine, and olive oil. If you had these three things, congratulations, you were a functioning Roman. Bread was the staple of life, making up 70 to 80% of the average diet. In other words, ancient Rome was one giant carb-fueled civilization. Besides that, wine wasn't a luxury there, it was just fancy hydration, since water quality was sketchy at best. And olive oil wasn't just for cooking. It was shampoo, lotion, lamp fuel, and probably what Romans used instead of chapstick. But while the rich feasted on roasted meats, exotic fruits, and imported delicacies, the poor were out here just trying to get their hands on some free government bread. Enter the cura annonae, Rome's first welfare system, which provided 200,000 of the poorest citizens with free or heavily subsidized grain. Because the government understood a very important political truth. If you keep the people full, they riot less. Of course, even with all that imported grain, Rome still needed fresh food, which meant a daily stampede of animals being herded straight into the city. Imagine thousands of cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens clogging the streets every day, because that is exactly what happened. If you were unlucky enough to live near a market, your alarm clock wasn't the sun, it was the sound of 100 panicked goats losing their minds. And speaking of farming, Romans were import-reliant and insanely good farmers. Their crop rotation, irrigation systems, and soil management techniques were so efficient that medieval Europe didn't surpass Roman agricultural production until the 19th century. And since they had 1 million people producing waste every single day, they turned human and animal waste into fertilizer. Nothing was wasted because in Rome, poop was basically liquid gold. Farmers would actually pay good money for city waste, and Roman law even prohibited selling a farm without its manure heap because, priorities. And while this all sounds impressive, Rome still had a serious trash problem. Because when you pack 1 million people into one city with no garbage trucks, things get messy. And if you thought the streets smelled bad before, imagine a pile of sweaty underwear stuffed in a gym bag left in a hot car for a week. Now, multiply that by 1 million. If you think your city's sanitation department is bad, let me introduce you to ancient Rome, where garbage collection was just, hope it rains soon. There were no trash bins, no garbage men, and absolutely no scheduled pickups. Instead, Romans just dumped their waste wherever they felt like it, because apparently sidewalks were just medieval dumpsters, and if you stepped in something questionable, well, that was your problem now. But Romans actually produced way less waste than we do today. There were no plastic wrappers, no disposable coffee cups, and no Amazon Prime boxes stacking up in the corner like a shrine to an online shopping addiction. Almost everything was reused or repurposed. Take ceramic shards, for example. If a pot broke, they didn't just sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened, like your landlord does with maintenance requests. No. Romans collected and stockpiled broken pottery at sites like Monte Testaccio, a literal mountain of discarded clay pots that archaeologists are still studying today, because when Rome threw something away, it did it in bulk. Take another example, urine. Oh, that wasn't waste, that was a business. Romans collected and sold their pee to tanners and laundries, because apparently nothing cleaned a toga like a good old-fashioned ammonia bath. This means some Romans literally made a living by collecting pee, which honestly is still a better job than customer service. But what about food scraps? Well, if you didn't eat it, something else would. Rome was full of stray dogs, pigs, and rats that acted as the city's unofficial cleanup crew. If you were tossing leftovers into the street, some animal would take care of it, one way or another. And honestly, that was the sanitation system. And when it came to cleaning up literally everything else, rain handled the rest. And if it didn't rain, well, sucks for you. This is why Romans were constantly complaining about the smell. Some people even described the streets as rivers of filth, which sounds dramatic until you remember that some unlucky pedestrians were probably getting hit with that filth. If you ever thought getting splashed by a passing car on a rainy day was bad, imagine that, but instead of water, it's, well, let's just say you would be burning those sandals. Still, for a civilization that had no garbage collection, Rome didn't collapse under its own filth. And part of the reason was roads. Because nothing says functioning empire like a transportation network so good people are still using it 2,000 years later. You know how people say, all roads lead to Rome? That wasn't just a saying, it was a fact. At its peak, Rome had over 400,000 kilometers of roads, built so efficiently that some are still in use today. Meanwhile, my local highway has been under construction for 6 years and still looks like a war zone. These roads were Rome's secret weapon. They allowed for insanely fast military deployment, efficient trade routes, and easy travel between provinces. The Roman army could move thousands of troops across the empire in record time, which is why you didn't want to mess with Rome unless you enjoyed losing. Rome absolutely dominated Mediterranean trade. The empire controlled every major port, making sure that grain, wine, olive oil, and luxury goods flowed straight into the capital. If Rome wanted something from the provinces, it got it. And when the city needed massive grain shipments from Egypt, it had dedicated grain fleets ensuring that Rome never ran out of bread. Basically, the entire empire was designed to keep the capital thriving. If you lived in a province, your job was to grow food, mine resources, and send it all to Rome. But for all its power, all its infrastructure, and all its logistical brilliance, Rome had one massive problem that would eventually come back to haunt it. Because when you build a civilization that relies on constant expansion, endless imports, and the labor of conquered peoples, what happens when the empire stops growing? It does not end well. For centuries, Rome was unstoppable, but eventually it got too big for its own good. The empire stretched from Britain to the Middle East, and trying to manage that was like trying to run a Fortune 500 company with a flip phone. First, overexpansion and corruption started taking a toll. Rome had too many borders to defend, and its leaders were more interested in power struggles than actually running the empire. The army, once the most feared force in the world, became a bloated, undisciplined mess, filled with mercenaries who cared more about their paychecks than Rome. Then came economic collapse. Rome's economy ran on conquest, and once the empire stopped expanding, the money dried up. Inflation skyrocketed, taxes crushed the poor, and even the rich started feeling it, which honestly is when governments actually start worrying. And then came the barbarians. The Germanic tribes had been knocking on Rome's door for centuries, but now Rome was too weak to stop them. The Visigoths sacked the city in 410 AD, the Vandals in 455 AD, and by 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was completely done. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, hung on for another 1,000 years, but the Rome we all know, game over. Rome wasn't perfect. It was dirty, dangerous, and chaotic, but it was also brilliant. Its urban planning, aqueducts, roads, and military strategies were so ahead of their time that we are still using them today. Even now, when you drive down a straight road, flush your toilet, or enter a stadium built for tens of thousands of screaming fans, you are experiencing something Rome perfected. So next time you're stuck in traffic, annoyed by city planning, or frustrated by how expensive food is, just remember, ancient Rome had it worse, and yet, for centuries, it ran like a well-oiled, occasionally corrupt, borderline insane machine. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more historical breakdowns. Because trust me, history is way messier than your high school textbooks ever let on.